right now. Because most people have never heard this story, and the ones who have wished they could forget how badly the system got played. 1971. The muscle car era is dying. The government is killing it. Insurance companies are burying it. And every serious competitor at every NHRA dragstrip in America is feeling that slow, painful death in real time. And then, into all of that, a man pulls up in the most forgettable, most ordinary, most completely unremarkable 1971 Chevrolet you have ever seen in your life. It makes one run. The timing board posts a number that should not exist. And nobody, not the competitors, not the officials, not the people whose entire job was to catch exactly this kind of thing, nobody could explain it. They inspected that car. Passed it. It ran again. Same number. Passed it again. This went on long enough that other drivers were going home between events tearing their own engines apart in the dark, convinced the problem was them. It wasn't them. Here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. When they finally did find something in that car, after all that time, after all those passes, after all those impossible timing board numbers, the violation they documented was smaller than the advantage it was supposed to explain. Which means either they missed something, or this man was operating at a level that 1971 simply had no tools to measure. I'll let you decide which one is more disturbing. Full story. Right now. And I promise you, the ending changes how you think about this sport forever. 1971 and the world that built this car. Before we talk about the car, we need to talk about the world it was born into. Because 1971 wasn't just another year. It was a funeral. And most people at the party didn't even realize they were mourning something. The muscle car era was dying in real time. Not slowly, violently. Federal emissions regulations were arriving like a wrecking ball. Insurance companies had looked at what young men were doing with high-compression V8s and decided they wanted no part of it. Compression ratios that had been producing honest, aggressive, street-terrifying horsepower through the late 60s were being strangled down across every manufacturer's lineup almost simultaneously. The cars that rolled off assembly lines in 1971 were physically different machines from what had come before, not because the engineers wanted them to be, but because the world outside the factory had made the old way impossible to defend publicly. And here is the part that most people don't talk about when they discuss this era. The manufacturers were lying. Openly, deliberately, and with full knowledge of exactly what they were doing. Horsepower figures being printed in brochures and on window stickers bore increasingly little resemblance to what those engines were actually producing. The numbers were being massaged downward, understated to appease regulators, to lower insurance classifications, to survive in a political environment that had decided performance was a problem to be solved rather than a feature to be celebrated. Think about what that means for a moment. The entire industry was publicly retreating while privately trying to keep the flame alive. Engineers who had spent their careers chasing horsepower were now being asked to chase compliance. And the gap between what these cars were on paper and what they actually were in reality, that gap was real. It was measurable. And to the right kind of mind, it was exploitable. Now drop into the NHRA super stock paddock in 1971. This is a world that runs on precise numbers. Displacement limits. Minimum weights. Specific component requirements. A rulebook that is updated constantly because smart people are constantly finding edges. And into this world comes a new variable, a factory landscape where the official specifications no longer reliably described what was actually inside these cars. If you're sitting in a shop in 1971 and you understand what's happening better than most people do, what do you see? You see chaos. You see an industry in transition. You see a regulatory environment scrambling to catch up with technology and market forces simultaneously. You see a rulebook built on assumptions that no longer reflect reality. And if you are the right kind of person, the kind who reads gaps the way other people read headlines, you see something else entirely. You see opportunity hiding in plain sight. Dressed in ordinary sheet metal. Sitting in a parking lot that nobody is watching. The man who saw what nobody else saw. I want you to think about someone in your own life. Not a famous person. Someone you've actually met. Someone who, when they walk into a room full of complicated problems, doesn't get overwhelmed. They get quiet. They get focused. They start seeing solutions before anyone else has finished describing the problem. You know the type. And you know how unsettling it can be to compete against that type. Because they're not working harder than you in the obvious ways. They're working differently. They're asking different questions. And by the time you realize what those questions were, they've already built the answers. That is the man behind this car. He did not come from money. He did not come from a factory program with resources and engineers and infrastructure. He came from a shop. A real shop. The kind with grease permanently worked into the floor and tools hung in positions worn smooth by years of the same hands reaching for the same things. He learned engines the way that knowledge actually sticks, by breaking them, understanding exactly why they broke, and building the next one with that failure built into his preparation. His reputation in the paddock was not loud. He didn't talk about what he was doing. He didn't make predictions before races or explanations after them. He showed up. He ran. He left. The timing board said everything he was willing to say publicly. And what the timing boards were saying was starting to make people deeply uncomfortable. Because here's the thing about this man that separated him from the usual fast car stories. He wasn't just trying to win races. He was trying to prove something specific, that the system, any system, built by human beings with human blind spots and human assumptions, will always contain gaps. Will always contain spaces between the rules where the rulebook's authors never thought to look. And that a patient enough, thorough enough, intelligent enough person could find those spaces and build a car inside them. He wasn't just racing the competition. He was racing the institution itself. And he had been preparing for that race for a very long time before anyone realized the competition had started. Ask yourself this, and I genuinely want you to think about it because it matters to how you understand everything that comes next. Is there a difference between finding a rule and following it perfectly, and finding the gaps between rules and operating in those gaps? Are those the same thing morally? Are they the same thing legally? Because your answer to that question is going to determine whether the man behind this car is a genius or a cheat. And I'm not sure the answer is as obvious as you think it is right now. What they actually did to this car. Here's where I need you to pay very close attention. Because this is the part that every other version of this story gets completely wrong. They reduce it to one trick. One illegal part. One clever shortcut that a sneaky builder slipped past distracted officials. And that version is not just incomplete. It fundamentally misses what made this car genuinely extraordinary. This was not one trick. This was a philosophy. Built into every single component of that car from the ground up. Let's start with the engine. And I need to give you some context here that most people don't have, because without it the rest of this doesn't make sense. In 1971 the horsepower numbers being printed on factory documentation were, to put it plainly, fiction. Creative, deliberate, carefully calculated fiction. Manufacturers were underrating their engines, publishing numbers significantly below what those engines were actually producing, to satisfy regulators, to lower insurance classifications, to survive in a political environment that had decided high horsepower was a public menace. This was not a secret inside the industry. Everyone who worked with these engines knew the published numbers were wrong. The question was how wrong, and in which direction. Now think about what that means for the NHRA rulebook. The rulebook was written around published specifications. Displacement limits, compression ratios, power ratings, all of it anchored to factory documentation that the factories themselves knew was inaccurate. Which means the rulebook was, without anyone intending it to be, built on a foundation of numbers that didn't reflect reality. And the gap between what the rules assumed these engines were and what these engines actually were, that gap was the first space this builder walked directly into. He didn't just know what these engines could do on paper. He knew what they could do in reality. And he knew that the rulebook, written around the paper version, had no language to address the real version. That informational advantage alone, just knowing the truth that the rules were built on a fiction, was worth something before he had touched a single wrench. But the engine was only the beginning. Here's the concept that I want you to really absorb because it explains everything else about how this car was built. There is a difference between pushing one thing too far and pushing 20 things slightly. Push one thing too far and an inspector finds it immediately. It stands out, it screams wrong, it ends your day in the tech bay. But push 20 things by 5% each? The compound effect of those 20 small pushes is enormous. The car is dramatically faster than it has any right to be. But no single measurement, examined in isolation, produces that alarm bell moment. No single component makes an inspector stop and call his supervisor. Everything looks like it falls within the acceptable range. Because individually, it does. The genius was not in finding one big illegal modification. The genius was in understanding that the inspection process, any inspection process, examines parts, components, individual measurements. It almost never steps back and looks at the whole picture simultaneously. And a builder who understands that limitation can distribute his advantage across enough individual elements that the total never becomes visible even when every piece of it has been examined. Every single component on that car had been evaluated not just for what it did but for how much it would be scrutinized. High-visibility components, the obvious things an inspector reaches for first, were impeccable. Beyond reproach. Because this builder understood that the best place to hide something is right next to something that is obviously clean. If the first three things an inspector checks are perfect, his attention starts to relax. His instinct starts to tell him this is a straight car. And that relaxation, that micro-drop in scrutiny, is exactly the environment where the real preparation survives undetected. Then there was the weight management. And this is where it gets almost beautiful from an engineering standpoint if you can separate it from the ethical questions for a moment. Every gram on a drag car is a negotiation. A constant, exhausting, detail-obsessed negotiation between what the rulebook forces you to carry and what physics demands you eliminate. Most builders in that class were having that negotiation at a surface level, stripping obvious weight, running lighter in the obvious places, doing what everyone else was doing because everyone else was doing it. This builder was having that negotiation at a level of granularity that his competitors didn't know was available. He had read the weight requirements in the rulebook down to the specific language, not to understand what was required, but to understand where the language was imprecise. Where a measurement was actually taken versus where it was simply assumed. What had to be a specific factory component versus what simply had to be present in a general sense. And in every place where the language left room, where the rulebook said a component must exist but didn't specify exactly which version, he had sourced the version that satisfied the requirement while weighing less than anything the rulebook's authors had imagined someone would find. He wasn't cheating the weight rules. He was reading them more carefully than the people who wrote them. And the difference between those two things, in 1971, was measured in pounds that nobody could officially point to. And then, and this genuinely fascinates me every time I think about it, there was the chassis. The suspension geometry. The weight transfer management at launch. The way the car was set up to keep all four tires loaded and working through the entire run rather than just the first few feet. This wasn't bolt-on performance. This was systems thinking applied to a drag car at a level that most independent builders of that era simply weren't operating at. Understanding how every variable interacted with every other variable. How a change in one area created effects 3 systems away. How to tune not just for peak performance but for consistent, repeatable, inspection-surviving performance that produced the same number weekend after weekend. Because here's something that gets overlooked in fast car stories. Anyone can get lucky once. A perfect launch, a good track, the right weather conditions, anyone can post one number that surprises people. What this car was doing was posting the same surprising number consistently. And consistency is not luck. Consistency is preparation so thorough that the variables have been removed from the equation. Consistency is the signature of someone who has thought about this more carefully and more completely than everyone else in the field. Now take all of that. The engine built on the gap between published fiction and mechanical reality. The 20 small pushes that added up to one enormous invisible advantage. The weight sourced from places the rulebook didn't think to specify. The chassis tuned with a systems-level understanding that his competitors didn't know to bring to the track. Put all of that into one plain, ordinary, forgettable 1971 Chevrolet. And what you have is not just a fast car. What you have is a physical argument. A rolling, breathing, timing board-destroying argument that the system as it existed in 1971, the rulebook, the inspection process, the entire regulatory framework that was supposed to ensure a level playing field, was not capable of containing what a sufficiently intelligent, sufficiently obsessive, sufficiently patient builder could construct within its own language. That argument went to the dragstrip every weekend. It made its runs. It posted its numbers. And for longer than anyone in authority was comfortable admitting afterward, it won. Every single time. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a dragstrip when something genuinely inexplicable happens. You've probably felt a version of it in your own life. The moment when reality produces a result that your brain refuses to immediately accept. Where you saw what happened but you can't yet make it fit into your understanding of how things work. That silence started following this car from event to event. And it grew. The elapsed times were not just fast. They were wrong in a way that experienced people felt before they could articulate. A seasoned racer develops an instinct for what a car should run based on how it sounds, how it launches, how it moves through the traps. That instinct is built from thousands of hours of observation and it is surprisingly accurate. And the instinct of everyone watching this 1971 Chevy was telling them one consistent thing: that number should not have come up. Competitors went home between events and did something that racers rarely do: they second-guessed themselves. They tore into engines that didn't need tearing into. They questioned setups that had been working. They lost sleep over a gap they couldn't explain and couldn't close no matter what they changed on their own cars. And that psychological dimension of what this car was doing, the way it made people doubt their own preparation rather than question the car they were losing to, that was almost as damaging as the times themselves. Think about what that does to a competitor. You're not just losing races. You're losing confidence in your own understanding of what's possible. You start wondering if you've fundamentally missed something, if there's a level of preparation you didn't know existed. And that doubt, that creeping, undermining, sleep-stealing doubt, is a form of winning that never shows up in the official results. Officials were watching by now. Not openly. Not in a way that created confrontation before there was evidence. But watching in the careful, patient way that people watch when a pattern has entered a range that professional obligation requires them to take seriously. The times were one thing. The consistency of the times was another. A car that gets lucky occasionally is interesting. A car that produces the same inexplicable results week after week is a problem that needs an explanation. And the car kept running. And the times kept coming. And the silence kept getting louder. The deeper inspection that finally happened was not routine. Everyone in that paddock knew it wasn't routine. The officials who conducted it had been briefed. They were not walking in cold. They were walking in with a specific mandate. Find what is making this car run these times. Because the times demand an explanation and the surface inspections aren't providing one. What followed was the most thorough teardown this car had experienced outside of its own builder's shop. And what emerged from that teardown was complicated in a way that nobody on either side of it was entirely comfortable with. They found things. Specific, documentable things that pushed against the boundaries of what the rulebook permitted. Individual measurements that fell outside the acceptable range. Components that on closer examination were not quite what they appeared to be at a glance. Each violation, written up individually, looked like the kind of thing that could be a mistake. An oversight. A part sourced incorrectly. Taken together, they told a different story. A story of someone who had thought about every one of these things deliberately and made calculated decisions about each one. But here's what genuinely unsettled the officials involved. And this is the detail that gets left out of every version of this story that I've found. The violations they documented, taken together, calculated out, run through the math of what they should theoretically produce in performance terms, did not account for the times this car had been running. The advantage on paper was smaller than the advantage on the timing boards. Which meant one of two things. Either there were additional violations that the inspection didn't reach, or the legal preparation on this car was so far beyond what anyone else in the class was doing that even clean, the car would have been extraordinary. Neither answer was satisfying. Both answers were disturbing in different ways. And the ruling that came down reflected that discomfort, specific violations addressed, specific penalties applied, rulebook updated to close the gaps that had been identified. Clean and official on paper. Deeply unresolved underneath. The builder accepted the ruling with the same quiet he had always carried. He didn't argue publicly. He didn't make statements. He went back to his shop. And the people who knew him well enough to read his silence said that the silence looked less like defeat and more like a man who had already moved on to thinking about the next set of gaps. What this car actually means. I want to ask you something directly. And I want you to actually think about it rather than just react. If a rule exists and you follow it perfectly, every measurement, every specification, every requirement, but you do so in a way that produces a result the rule was designed to prevent, have you broken the rule? Technically no. But something happened that wasn't supposed to happen. The system produced an outcome it was engineered to prevent. Who is responsible for that? The person who followed the letter of the rules? Or the people who wrote rules with gaps wide enough to drive a 1971 Chevy through? That question matters beyond drag racing. It matters in every competitive environment that humans construct. In business, in law, in finance, in technology. The people who find the gaps are sometimes called cheaters and sometimes called innovators, and the difference between those two labels often has more to do with whether they got caught than whether what they did was fundamentally different. The man behind this car believed, and I think genuinely, not as a rationalization, that his job was to understand the system better than the system understood itself. That if the rulebook had a gap, the gap was the rulebook's failure, not his crime. That preparation which the written rules did not prohibit was by definition legal preparation, regardless of what the spirit of those rules intended. You can agree with that or disagree with it. But consider this before you decide. The rules he exposed as insufficient were updated because of him. The inspection process that failed to catch him was revised because of him. The technical understanding of what was possible in that class was permanently elevated because of him. He made the system better by breaking it. Is that a disservice to the sport? Or is it exactly the kind of stress testing that any system needs to survive long-term? And here is the final thing I want to leave you with. The timing boards don't lie. The times this car ran were real. The performance was real. Some portion of it came from preparation that pushed against the rules. But some portion, perhaps a larger portion than anyone was comfortable acknowledging publicly, came from preparation that was simply better than what everyone else was doing. From a mind that worked harder on the right problems than any competitor in that class. The 1971 Chevy that outsmarted the system did exactly what its name suggests. It found the system's edges, it built itself into those edges, and it ran until the system caught up. And then the builder went back to his shop and started looking for the next edge. That is not a cheating story. That is a human story. About obsession, about intelligence, about the eternal competition between the person who wants to find the limit and the institution trying to define where the limit is. And the reason it still matters, the reason you just spent 30 minutes watching a video about a car from 1971, is that competition of that kind never ends. It just changes shape. Every generation of motorsport produces someone like this. Someone who looks at the rules not as boundaries but as blueprints. Who reads the gaps between the lines and builds something in those gaps that the people who wrote the lines never imagined. Sometimes history calls those people cheaters. Sometimes it calls them pioneers. And sometimes, honestly, truthfully, uncomfortably, it calls them both at the same time. The 1971 Chevy is gone now. The timing board numbers it posted are just records in old logbooks that most people will never read. But the questions it raised, about rules and gaps and the line between genius and violation, those questions are still alive. They show up in every competitive environment that exists today. Where do you draw that line? Drop it in the comments. Because I genuinely don't think there's one right answer. And the conversation down there is always more interesting than anything I can say up here. If this story hit different, like, subscribe and stay close. Because next week we are going somewhere that makes this look like an introduction. A story buried so deep in NHRA history that most people in the sport don't even know it happened. You're not going to want to miss that one.